Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm Atlantic Council Vice President and Director of the Brent Scowcroft Center here. Welcome to the Atlantic Council for quite a distinctive discussion and event, I think you'll agree, here in Washington in 2015. In recent times, scholars and policymakers and others have been questioning the future of global governance and the nature of great power dynamics in the era that we find ourselves in. Certainly there are powerful global trends reshaping our demographics, advanced technologies having their own effects, building and in some cases diminishing individual empowerment, and a number of trends in the food, water, energy nexus area that are also influencing relations among nation states. At the Scowcroft Center, as many of you may know, we're making concerted efforts through each of our initiatives, but in particular, we have Matt Burrows, who is the director of the Strategic Foresight Initiative, and Dan Chu, who is the director of our strategy work, looking to understand how to implement policy in a way that's informed by longer-term strategic thinking, and certainly General Scowcroft himself has been emphasizing that, the importance of that to us as well. And so in that spirit, about 2 years, over the last 2 years, the Scowcroft Center has partnered with the Moscow-based Primakov Institute for World Economy and International Relations, and we're very pleased to have the director here, Dr. Dinkin, of that institute, to jointly produce a report on global trends out to 2035. We're publishing the executive summary today. Hopefully many of you have that. The much longer and fuller report will be available next month. We're also having it translated into Russian, and we'll have a similar event in Moscow once that is ready. While both institutions conceived the idea for the joint work before the Ukraine crisis, the current spike in U.S.-Russian tensions has added urgency to find ways to find common ground in areas where we might seek to do so, even as both countries attend to their own strong perceptions of their national interests in a number of areas. Interestingly, during this work, both sides had very few analytic differences on this effort, even as the rift in relations between our governments has grown. We believe that there is an urgent need to put into place processes whereby current differences can be discussed and ideally resolved, again, with due attention to national interests. Both teams here strongly believe that the shared analysis of the forces that are eroding the foundations of the international system, we don't even know what to call it. Some people still are calling it post-Cold War. Those forces that are analyzed in the joint report could help guide the development of a different order, of an inclusive order and an effective international order that could help reduce the risks of conflict while providing a framework for global cooperation. This report, and it is dire reading, but I think very important and very rich, it warns of the risks of escalating conflict. It paints a worst-case scenario of a new bipolar world in which there's an alignment of China and Russia together on one side and the United States and its allies on the other. This would not be a new Cold War, but it would be a very daunting and dangerous world. With the release of this report, we want to move the conversation forward on finding common ground and constructing truly forward-thinking policies, with the idea that as you look at the longer-range trends, it helps to give perspective and to develop strategies and policies that can more effectively address the nearer-term concerns as well. But I now want to especially thank Alexander Dinkin, the director of the Primakov Institute, and Fyodor Voitilovsky, the deputy director for international politics, for coming all this way to discuss this joint report for the first time here in Washington. As I mentioned, Matt Burrows, the director of our Strategic Foresight Initiative, led the effort on our side. Matt has decades of experience in analyzing long-range trends. And also Bob Manning, a senior fellow in the Scowcroft Center, was a core participant as well throughout this work. We've had the good fortune of generous support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, From Michael Calvi, Senior Partner of Baring Bostock Capital Partners and an Atlanta Council Board Member, and Ms. Patricia Cloherty, the Chairman and CEO of Delta Private Equity Partners. Finally, I'd like to express my appreciation for Ed Luce, the Chief U.S. columnist of the Financial Times, for moderating this discussion on the joint report. Ed has been a faithful follower of our strategic foresight efforts and vice versa. We will be tweeting this. This is a public event. It's on the record. And so we encourage people to tweet. The hashtag is AC Strategy. And we'll be tweeting from the accounts at AC Scowcroft and at AC Foresight. And so without further ado, I want to turn it over to Ed Luce.
Thanks a lot, Barry. And is this working? Yes. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here once again. As Barry said, this is a cheerful topic, global system on the brink, pathways to a new normal. We've really got an extremely impressive US-Russian panel here of the world's top futurologists, if you'll permit me to use that description of you. Before I probe your pessimism, because I do think pessimistic is a fair characterization of your report, let me just turn it over to Matt to make a few opening remarks, and then Alexander will respond, and then we'll get stuck into a discussion.
Well, thanks, Ed, and again, thanks for moderating the panel. I wanted to begin talk a little bit about, I think, some of the issues that we have in the report that are not likely to be the headline ones. I mean, obviously, we're going to talk a lot about the geopolitical shifts, this idea of bipolar world, and we can certainly get deep into it. But a lot of our thinking has been very much influenced by what is happening, I would say, at a lower level, the more domestic level. And the work actually begins by looking at globalization and where we are in terms of globalization. So a couple of the issues that, for me, are just as concerning as the more geopolitical tensions that we particularly know about in a place like this and certainly in Washington. And we talk about, in the report, the increasing gaps between the core and the periphery. Something that is really exacerbated by the technological revolution, at least at this point of the technological revolution. We also talk about the breakdown of globalization really into regionalization based upon trade patterns, based upon a much more polycentric financial architecture that we see developing. In the last couple days, we've seen the RMB become part of the IMF basket. That isn't necessarily bad, but if it furthers the fragmentation that we're seeing at the geopolitical level, then I think it is, reinforcing the bad tendencies of these tensions and breakdowns at the higher level. The real worries about some of the regions. Africa, here you have great potential, but you're also seeing, in terms of agriculture, the productivity actually slide. So here they have the biggest area of variable land, but they're not producing. They also have the greatest potential demographically. They're going to be, by 2040, 2050, really the place that provides the working age population in the world. But it needs to get, a lot of the governance needs to get fixed if they're going to realize that potential. Latin America, we're looking at potentially a third of the middle class, which has recently become middle class, potentially slide back into kind of the upper reaches of poverty. And obviously Middle East, where you see violence feeding on violence. And we have a scenario there of really of an expanding conflict. And of course, with conflict, you're not going to see the economic development potential. So these are issues that I think are really the driving forces of this more pessimistic outlook. Obviously, we have some, throughout we talk about opportunities, And there, really, it's, up to us, I think. And this is the, really the audience we're trying to reach is really the elites, the governing institutions throughout the world to understand exactly what is happening at this lower level and to really seize the moment. We do have a number of opportunities, and again, those are listed there to make sure that we can go into a much more positive path. So my final remark is, the pessimism I think is well grounded, but you don't necessarily have to have this pessimistic future. That we do have ways of shaping it in another direction.
Thanks, Matt. Alexander.
Thank you. As already was said, we started this project before February 2014. And even in those times, the level of trust towards Washington and Moscow, I can say, was not very high. But after Ukrainian crisis, it's sliding maybe even below zero. So when I'm looking back, say, to the year 2001, when two powers operated after 9/11 in, say, quasi-alliance basis in toppling Taliban regime in Kabul, it seems from today like a miracle, like a fantasy. But we are here not to look back. We are here about the future. And I would say that we are already living in a rather dangerous world. The bipolar system, crystal clear, simplistic. In this world, there were enough just one Berlin Wall. Today, there are 64 walls or fences are erecting along the borderlines between the states. And for me, this is a metaphor of the current chaotic global order. So what were the reasons when we decided to launch this project together with Atlantic Council? Firstly, I'm speaking on my own. We are concerned citizens, and we are deeply dissatisfied with the current state of Russia-US relations. And in my perception, both countries has very asymmetric picture of the global realities. So key idea was to try to bridge this gap in those perceptions. I may tell you that before existed certain set of strategic values, which was elaborated during the decades of a strategic limitation agreement. Today, this culture no more existed. I guess the same true about security culture. Today, 45 states are considering new nuclear programs. Our outlook suggests that by 2035, there would be already 15 members of the nuclear club comparing with current 9 members. So many of these countries, of course, they have no adequate security regime. More than that, states are no more possess the monopoly on technologies and know-how. And nuclear weapon, especially the dirty one, or bioweapon, is no more a high-tech. Garage production of it is not a fiction. And of course, ISIS is clearly hunger for weapons of mass destruction. And today, they control Mosul University laboratories, and of course, such technologies as drone, 3D printing adds some dark colors to this even murky reality. So I do believe that in this environment, we are facing today the dangerous race between cooperation and catastrophe. Second reason, that we believe that in the time when official channels are completely blocked, this is the exact time for a second track job. So I guess that we could not permit ourselves the luxury of total confrontation as it was in the time of the Cold War. And thirdly, of course, I appreciate the professional state of art of the several global trends reports which were produced under Matt Barrow's leadership. At MMO, we also possess decades-long experience of producing long-term outlook, so we decided to merge our efforts. So I guess that we try to produce best, to our knowledge, consistent, integrated picture of the possible pathways out of the brink towards new normality in the coming 20 years. Of course, we address this report to the expert community, to the general public, and of course, to the leaders of our countries.
Thank you. I had a very absorbing time reading this report, and whilst it was pessimistic and dire, as Barry called it, I felt it was also bracingly realistic. So let me just bring in Fyodor and Robert on that same broad question. You present three scenarios for the next 20 years of globalization. The first is a new post-Cold War, post-Cold War emerging bipolarity with, on the one hand, Russia and China and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in sort of one de facto anti-democratic bloc, anti-Western bloc, and emerging tensions, the breakdown of global cooperation, and the potential, very real and rising potential for conflict. Your second scenario is a sort of devolution into regional blocks, with the West, the East, maybe Eurasia, Middle East remaining a mess. But again, it's a deglobalization, or at least a reduced cooperation scenario. And your third is the continued growth of inclusive globalization, of inclusive liberal world order. And you make very, very clear in the report that scenario 3 is by far the least likely. So you're left with scenario 1, which, you know, at its worst end is sort of borderline apocalyptic, at its worst end. And scenario 2, which is not, you know, a happy clappy future of cooperation. It's one where we all retreat into our regional silos, and the common issues that we face, climate change obviously being one very much on our mind, but weapons of mass destruction, ISIS, the breakdown of the global internet, the balkanization of communication, and so forth, where we're not really in a position to cooperate in tackling these problems. Tell me, each of you, starting with Fyodor and then moving on to Robert, do you fully share this pessimistic prognosis? From a Russian perspective, I know it's in your culture, pessimism, but it's clearly spreading. It's spreading to America.
Don't judge. With Dostoevsky, we have a lot of optimism in our culture. But anyway, thank you for this question, because one of the critical issues for our report and for our discussions during preparing it was the role of major powers and the scenarios of development of relations between them. Because we are absolutely believe, and we have some proofs in economic data, that the liberal myth about the growth of interdependence as a stabilizing factor of the world economy and international politics is not working as well as it was supposed in the 1990s. Because together with interdependence, the competition between major powers on interstate level and on transnational level, on the level of transnational enterprise, is growing. And these two trends are not, they are not confronting each other. They're going together, and it's a dialectical, way of development of international politics. In the polycentric world order, the role not only of major powers, but of different centers of international system is growing. At the same time, this international system, and we wrote it in our report, is developing as a hierarchical system. And there are different players, major powers and other players, non-state actors, are taking some place in this hierarchy. And it doesn't mean that this place is forever. It's flexible. And it depends on many factors: financial, technological, economic, political. But the principal question is to which extent major powers and other actors interconnected to them will ready to build inclusive political international institutions, economic integration structures in two key regions, in Euro-Atlantic and in Asia-Pacific.
Robert, do you share that perspective?
Yeah, I wouldn't argue strongly with it. I mean, what I think, one thing we haven't talked about is domestic forces, because a global trend towards nativism, nationalism, ethno-nationalism, that I think is driving a lot of the things we're describing at the macro level.
Yeah, I want to get into that a little bit later. But I mean, IMEMO, your organization is the premier think tank in Russia. You advise President Putin. Your Russian Academy of Sciences founded. You're really the sort of up there as part of the Russian intellectual establishment. So your perspective is, I think, is particularly interesting. From a non-Russian point of view, you could look at the future of the world and think, well, look, if Russia wasn't electing or organizing the elections of people like Putin, maybe the optimistic scenario in this report, the number 3, would be far likelier. That, if you're talking about rogue actors, a lot of the world, and particularly in my part of the world, Europe, would look at Russia as being a rogue actor. Now, sorry, I'm being provocateur here. You're nice people. Please don't take this personally. But Alexander, what would you say to that? Is the rest of the world wrong to see Russia as a rogue actor and Putin as its unstable leader?
Look, a couple of sentences regarding your previous question. You mentioned these 3 scenarios.
Yeah.
And this is possible options. Mm-hmm. But in my perception, there would be no firewall in between of each of them. Mm-hmm. So in reality, it would be combination of these 3 possible paths. Regarding your second issue, it's, in my perception, very short-term approach to our realities. Without, let's say, history of the development of the so-called New Russia recently. The turning point, in my perception, was 1996 elections. Mm-hmm. Remember, non-popular Yeltsin, yes, and very popular Zyuganov. And here we came to the issue of the quality of the opposition. In case of Poland, Kwasniewski, also perceived by some forces as a very red, but he goes in lines with the Polish constitution. We were not quite sure about Zyuganov, because if you read his program, it would be total nationalization, cancellation of the convertibility of ruble, monopoly on the foreign trade, state planning committee, and so on and so forth. So this is maybe the bad fate of Russia, that we have the opposition of this quality.
Okay, can I add 2 words?
Please.
I can say one more thing, but because, of course, Western media succeeded in demonization of Mr. Putin and personification of Russian foreign policy during the Ukrainian crisis, and before that even. But if we will look attentively to different steps of Russian government from 2001, Russian political elite and Russian government was looking to be more engaged with the West, and suggested many times, sort of opportunities, sort of ideas. For example, President Medvedev suggested a treaty on European security, which was completely declined by the West. And Russia was asking NATO, for example, for many times for cooperation with Organization of Cooperative Security Treaty on Afghanistan and Central Asia issues. Nobody responded. So I'm not trying to advocate my government. Of course, we have advantages and disadvantages of the path we're developing now. But I want to insist on the idea that both sides were absolutely inadequate and were not ready to build inclusive international security architecture. And even in sphere of arms control, it's a miracle that during period of reset, we reached Praha Treaty. And how we will be, both sides, I mean, will be ready to develop this architecture, especially in Euro-Atlantic, where now we see, the highest level of tensions, will be the answer to your question.
No, I appreciate there is strategic misunderstanding here and that there's misperceptions on both sides. So let's get into US strategic myopia, if you will. And let's talk about your report's supposition that the US is no longer the dominant superpower. It will be primus inter pares. It'll be first amongst equals, and there's a vast difference between these two levels of power, particularly when it comes to building global institutions or reforming existing global institutions to take account of the rapidly changing world. And we can think of examples like the World Trade Organization, the Bretton Woods, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and so forth. So the U.S. is declining. Are we clear on that? Is that your view, Matt?
A relative decline. I mean, we've said that for some time.
You have.
And it isn't, we're not in this unipolar moment. I'm not sure that actually existed. We certainly believed it existed at one point, but not, I don't think, you're right. You can't, U.S. has enormous amount of power, but probably only if it understands the circumstances, the strategic environment in which we're overplaying its hand, trying to be the unipolar power.
So I guess
would be a huge strategic blunder.
This gets into what Robert briefly mentioned, which is not so much the hard assets of the U.S., but the soft assets, what you're doing with the still immense power you have, or what you're not doing, and indeed what Fyodor mentioned in terms of misunderstanding between Russia and the West. So in an era where the US needs to be making adjustments, it needs to be understanding the changing gravity, economic gravity of the world, and incorporating rising Chinas and Indias into the global institutions, we have Donald Trump leading the Republican field. We have many Donald Trumps following him. We have Jeb Bush sort of completely abandoning the sane middle ground and now basically cutting his cloth more and more to Donald Trump. How does this look from Russia, Alexander? What's the perception of America's politics from Moscow?
Well, of course, those people you mentioned, they do not add some bright colors to our perception of American political system. Some people believe that we are watching sort of political circus. But we are very much attuned to this circus because we have Mr. Zhirinovsky in Russia. So some people can make comparison, parallels between...
Yeah, but he stands no chance of winning any elections. Putin's going to keep winning, right? So it's not apples with apples here.
This is very Russian perception. We do believe that this gentleman who is a great investor also have no chances to become a president of the United States.
Okay, so finally some optimism. we have... Good. Well, I'll take that prediction to the bank. Robert, talk to me a little bit about how you make strategic foreign policy in this kind of political climate.
Well, I think that's a big part of the problem. That I don't think we can say that for the past decade the U.S. is pursuing what I would call an enlightened self-interest. That the Americans have had a very difficult time adjusting to the diffusion of power in the world, and we still are there's still a psychology that it's still 1956, and you see it in the presidential debates, and you see it in Congress. My argument, and a lot of the things that are happening because of default on our part. For example, I think Congress bears a lot of the responsibility for the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Bank that the Chinese have launched. It has failed to ratify the UN reform in 2010 at the G20. and which would have given China more shares. We have not reformed the Asian Development Bank, which is run by the Japanese, with the Chinese playing a very small role. And I think if those things had happened, we probably wouldn't have an Asian Infrastructure Bank. So I don't think there's an alternative, and nobody's got a better idea than the Bretton Woods institutions, but the failure to, in a timely manner, modernize them to reflect the new power realities is creating what we're starting to see as competing visions of world order. We see it from Russia, this Eurasian vision of Mr. Putin. We see it from Xi Jinping. He's creating a whole set, has ideas for a whole set of parallel institutions. You mentioned the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and others across the board. And so that's the problem. I think how do you lead as a first among equals? How do you enfranchise, create a sense of enfranchisement for emerging economies and emerging powers?
I think one of the sort of key planks of your negative scenario is greater and greater cooperation between Russia and China and countries around it. And the one road, one belt China policy is linking up countries in between. As you say in the report, China is making a virtue of having 14 countries on its border, which would ordinarily be a vulnerability. It is turning into a virtue with these big infrastructure investments. You've got this massive, potentially massive at any rate, gas supply deal between Russia and China that President Putin signed last year with Xi Jinping. I guess the question is, and this is something Matt has said before, that there's a lot of expectation around the Russia-China relationship. There's a lot of smoke, but how much fire is there? How real is this? You're very, very different countries. And I mean, actually, first of all, like to pose that to Matt, and then get into Fyodor and Alexander's side. How real is Russia-China? How real is Russia's pivot to Asia? Fyodor, sure. Okay.
Thanks. Russia's pivot to Asia started even before the Ukrainian crisis, and it started from APEC summit in Vladivostok, and a strategic trend in Russian development. One of the key results of Russia's economy development of 1990s and 2000s was development of interdependence with EU. And but Russia was looking and is still looking for diversification of its economy and of its economic ties. In this sense, China is absolutely complementary partner. And One Belt, One Road program possibly could give, and other projects with China could give background for such new interdependence in economic sphere between China and Russia. But it doesn't mean a military bloc.
Okay, I get that, but Matt, I mean the complementarity of resources and trade. But Matt, is there something bigger here going on? Is there if not an ideological, a strategic commonality emerging between Russia and China?
I think there is. I mean, it depends on what the potential is over the longer run. And I think, part of it is that we don't recognize it in Washington. I mean, that we, as Fyodor was saying, I mean, we don't have much sense of history on this. I mean, it seems to us a reaction to the sanctions that were put in place on Ukraine. So Putin goes to Beijing and signs deals, and then that's when we seem to date this actual coming together. I mean, it's not certainly an alliance, but I would say over time it could grow into something that is, of real geopolitical significance. And I think there's a problem. I remember debating this in this town, the BRICS, when we were doing the first Global Trends 2020. And huge, everybody said this is just a construct of Goldman Sachs. Nothing there. And we really couldn't say. I mean, we knew the history of tensions between China and Russia. Brazil's in there, and nobody knows how it got in, except it seemed to lend the B to the BRICS. And India and China, we knew had a war. I mean, so we didn't have any understanding how this would actually be more than a construct, an investor's construct. And yet, I think what is there, and something that we don't understand still, is this feeling of being left out of this supposed Western liberal order. I mean, I remember going to Brazil and being lectured by the foreign minister, who had been ambassador here, about, U.S. exceptionalism was getting in the way of real global cooperation. And that, look, 10 years, 12 years on, we don't seem to have learned, despite the fact BRICS have a development bank, they have these regular summits. They also seem, if you're looking at some of the voting patterns in the UN, they abstain as they did after the Ukraine crisis. There is something going on, and I think it's more than we can't understand, because we carry around in our head this idea on the liberal order. Others don't feel that it's such a liberal order. And what I worry about is that, with that ideology, that ideological on both sides, that something that doesn't necessarily have to turn into a very strong alliance or grouping could end up being one.
But this is America's mistake to make. I mean, it's in terms of how you're characterizing it, it's how America handles this that's
well, it gets back
variable.
to, this idea of, do you want to be first among equals? And in my mind, that's where you're best friends with everybody, in a sense.
So you're
you work that network, and you derive your power from that. I think in a world which is broken up, and this is the concern on the regional, first, I think everybody's a loser in this world. I don't think anybody comes out a winner. But I think for U.S., I think...
In terms of state power, you're talking, or sort of...
In terms of, we have all these shared interests. All the major powers have huge numbers of shared interests. What Alexander was talking about, the counterterrorism, the proliferation, the climate change, all of these things. So if we can't cooperate, we all are going to be losers in that world.
Totally understood. Alexander, let me ask you a slightly more philosophical question about how Russia sees the world. There seems to be two sort of views of liberal order, the global liberal order unraveling. One is that we'd be very happy to sign up to it if we were included in it properly, if we were given our true voice. Another, which is one thing, and that's to do with America's own mistakes, unforced errors. And there's another, which is, no, we just don't believe in this anyway. Which is the Russian view?
Well, I would not again put this firewall in between economic models in the West and in Russia, let's say. For example, our labor legislation is much more liberal than, say, in Germany. Mm-hmm. So this just black and white attitude is not correct in principle. Of course, we are lagging behind in development of the market institution for understandable reasons. For example, I'm completely not satisfied with the level of competition in our economy. Mm-hmm. I'm not satisfied with the role of the state-owned corporation in our economy. And same true about Chinese. They're thinking for a long time, it's, let's say, politically not very easy, because it's a lot of entrenched bureaucracy around Chinese state companies, but say the thinking is how to privatize them, how to make them more, let's say, flexible, more efficient. Regarding the BRICS, one comment. Currently, I do believe that BRICS is much better institutionalized than G7, having in mind this bank and this fund and regular meeting. Mm-hmm. And thinking about this Russia's pivot toward the east, of course, this rift around Ukraine has pushed Russia towards China, definitely, for sure. It was decided before, but the other scenario would be unrealistic. But if you look at the current program of our development of the Far East and Eastern Siberia, it's completely liberal. The Vladivostok is Porto Franco since October 1st, so no taxation, visas on spot, 14 more ports on the Far East, the same regulation. They have special economic zones where the taxation legislation is much better than in Shenzhen, Singapore, or Taiwan. So it's very different attitude. And I have been at the first Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok and participated in an interesting meeting of the governors from Russia and from China across the border. And they talk on the same language, I mean not linguistically, but in terms of organizing economic cooperation. They have blamed each other for not fulfilling this plan, this supply, and so on and so forth. So it was very impressive that governors from two different countries talking about the same.
So let's look at another area of the world that you deal with in your report, the Middle East. Now, there's one very plausible scenario where all the firewalls can break down between, which is that the rest of the world continues to grow at varying speeds. There isn't any very impressive reform to the global institutions, but there isn't a sort of complete breakdown. But where you all face one threat increasingly in common, which is ISIS kind of terrorism, which is radicalism from a destabilizing Middle East, where there is a cold or hot war between the big Sunni and the big Shia powers, and where none of you can really think of a solution or impose one on your own, including the United States, where many of you, including China and India, increasingly rely on the region for their energy resources. Some people have mentioned the possibility of a grand concert of global powers coming together to fix the Middle East. Is that naive? Or is this an area where you could actually see countries like India and China and Russia more and more beginning to see that they have to have more skin in the game, and America is either unwilling or unable to stabilize the Middle East? Everybody has to. Fyodor.
I think that it's a question of responsibility of major powers, and especially question of responsibility of Russia and the United States. Because I do not see right now or in near future any reasons for China and India to join any coalition. Maybe in a symbolical level, yes, but on serious, even if some troubles like terrorist attack will happen in China or in India, they will try to use their potential to fight terrorist activity on their own. But I do not see them as major players on Middle East. Middle East is still the playground for major powers in its traditional understanding. And there, United States and Russia can play a significant role. But the question is, will both states will be responsible enough to cooperate and to build some cooperative infrastructure to which they can involve other partners? I do not see, now I have only reasons for pessimism in this sphere. I do not see even a very good response on both sides to French initiatives. But who knows what will happen in 3 or 4 years and how ISIS will develop. Will it transform to transnational infrastructure? In this case, if it will be not so located in the area of Middle East and will work globally as a transnational infrastructure, and I think it's the worst scenario, but the most possible one. It will be very, very hard, much more harder than now, to fight against ISIS and other transnational terrorist structure which will follow them.
Robert, do you think we could have a different U.S. approach to the Middle East with the next administration? one that is better able to get Russia to do whatever it is Russia needs
Well,
to
I think
do
there's a problem because we don't understand the Middle East very well, and that's how you got things like Iraq. And when we have a situation now where you have 4 failing states and this insurgency and the whole breakdown of the Sykes-Picot Arab state system, there'd be a logic to stepping back and saying, well, maybe we ought to rethink this. I don't see leadership in any major power able to do that. And I also think that what we've seen in the Middle East is it has to be internally generated. The whole Arab world has failed to come to terms with modernity. And in terms of defeating ISIS, until you have neighboring Arab and Islamic countries actively discrediting their interpretation of Islam, you're going to have this problem growing, and and that's at the intellectual level. At the practical level, you have armies of the surrounding countries that total about 5 million men. If they put 50,000 of those on the ground, they could probably wipe out ISIS fairly quickly, and yet they've all got other preoccupations. Even though I wonder about, for example, if I'm Saudi Arabia and there's an Islamic caliphate that claims to represent all of Islam, don't they have to at some point control Mecca and Medina? And why aren't the Saudis worried about that? So I don't quite understand the sense of priorities, but I think there has to be an internally generated change. I don't think this can be imposed completely. I think the Saudis and others and Turkey have to be involved in any kind of grand coalition.
Well, this is a term that comes up in your report. You need a Kissinger, right? You need somebody who's going to sort of thread all these needles and sort of conduct the orchestra and somehow get Turkey to do this and Saudi Arabia to do that. Alexander, I know you were going to chip in.
I guess that I'm starting this meeting saying that both countries has very much asymmetric pictures of the reality. Well, American perception is that Russia is protecting dictator in Syria, and this is the rift. This is the...
is that an incorrect perception?
Let me explain our perception lately.
Sure.
So this is American perception. I will be very short. In our perception, we are looking in more longer distance. Let me remind you this grand plan of wider Middle East, 2001, invented by one expert in PR, not a diplomat, not a scholar, not a military expert. And then this grand design was the key, let's say, key path of American foreign policy. What we have at the end of this wider Middle East? 4 falling states, as Bob said, millions of refugees, the death toll tremendous, death bodies on the Mediterranean beach. So we look at this as a learning curve. There is no more Saddam, chaos in Iraq. No more Gaddafi, chaos in Libya. So our idea is not to keep the Saddam, but to keep some limited state structures there, from which we could try to elaborate some path to normality in this country. This is a different attitude.
So we've learned, just to sort of press you on that, we've learned that when you remove Saddam, you don't do de-Baathification, right? Is you keep the structure there. So when we remove Assad, we keep the structure there. Is Assad's removal seems to be the minimum price for a global
The key message of our foreign ministry that we are trying to protect some government institutions.
Yeah.
There. Assad could be discussed. We have to start the political process.
But your perception of American diplomacy here, I just want to press you on this. If America was playing the game differently, if the Obama administration was playing the game differently, is a deal possible where Assad is removed, but there isn't a complete dismantling and vacuum created in Damascus? Is that kind of scenario
in my
realistic?
perception, I'm irresponsible scholar. It's visible.
Yeah.
It's visible.
I think the current approach is delusional. The notion that we're going to have some democratic transition in Syria, or even that a state called Syria can be reconstituted the way it was, in the same way I would add Iraq to that equation. I think you might have states whose borders externally are the same, but internally, I think the best case I could envision in Syria would be a very, very loose federation with Assad controlling a Rump Alawite section, the Kurds having a section, and the Sunnis. That's probably the best case, and I'm not even sure that's possible.
What, sectarian co-sharing? I mean, a Lebanon-type rule where the speaker's Shiite and the president's Maronite and the leader,
yeah,
whatever.
Yeah, Lebanization, you could call it. Yeah.
You could call it Lebanization. But that's not a disintegration of the state. I mean, that's actually a relatively optimistic scenario. Perhaps we're drilling too deep here. Sorry, I know we've got to cover the whole. We've got to cover the whole world. I want to sort of put. We're going to go to questions in a few minutes.
Add one thing. I mean, you know, however bad the Middle East is, I mean, I could see it as being an opportunity for actually. You know, what happened after the end of the 30 Years' War in Europe, a real diplomatic revolution in which, you know, we do have the outside great powers coming together as well as the powers right there to think about how you stop making war against your neighbor because of difference in values. And that we do need, you know, those kind of opportunities, those kind of crises actually could lead us to, I think, a much higher level of global cooperation. And the problem is that we don't have that Kissinger or that Metternich or whoever it is who can put together that global peace.
So let me sneak in a couple more questions. I know there will be questions from the audience. First, let me just put an optimistic scenario. Your report's pessimism about how the world might unfold in the next 20, 30 years is based on the breakdown of normal politics within countries, which makes the pursuit of rational foreign policy externally more and more difficult. Obviously, we've talked about Trump and politics here as being one example, but you can pick any country, including non-democracies, and make the same point. It's getting tougher. There is to cite Moises Naim's book, there is a sort of decline in traditional power of institutions. But on the other hand, there's this extraordinary convergence going on between the developing world, which is catching up with the developed world. After 200 years, 300 years of Western domination, we're having a convergence of global incomes. There might be growing inequality within countries, but there is growing equality between them. And this is historically a major plus, a major leap forward after colonialism and so forth. You also have an extraordinary flowering of science, of longevity, of medical frontiers, and of course communications. We've talked about the dark side of communications, and God knows ISIS is very good at exploiting that, but there is a very bright side as well. There is a Bill Gates description of the world that we're in. So it strikes me that pessimists might be slightly more institutional-minded people, might be slightly more statist, might be slightly more traditional in their way of thinking. But if you're a libertarian, you can construct a very plausible, optimistic case for the way the world is developing. How would you respond to this? I am playing devil's advocate here. I'm kind of more with you, but I can see the libertarian argument very clearly too. Do you have libertarians in Russia?
No, we have small amount of them. But if you mean the architecture of
the empowerment of individuals is what I'm talking about.
Empowered individuals. I think that we can see great changes in many developing countries and in new emerging economies. Changes which are driven by economic factors, but which are changing societies, which are changing political system. For example, in China, the emergence of Chinese middle class is one of the principal factors of domestic consumption and growth of domestic consumption, and of transformation of export-oriented Chinese economy, which is becoming more and more stabilized with domestic consumption and other factors. But on the level of international politics, the question is to which extent these transformations during next 20 years will give opportunity to build a new sort of regional leadership and to build more cooperative foreign policy strategies in these countries. Will they develop the same strategic, the same type, I do not mean ideologically or politically, but the same in the level of, the cognitive level, on the psychological level? Will they develop the same strategic culture as the United States and Soviet Union and then United States and Russia developed? It's the critical question. The critical question is psychology. In this sense.
Robert?
I think it is possible if we managed it properly, that we could go, that you're right, that there are a lot of, the diffusion of power creates a shared set of common goals, in theory at least. And that,
isn't there a contradiction there, though? You're saying if we manage it properly. The whole trend here is that it's hard to manage. It gets progressively more difficult to manage.
Right.
Autonomous.
Well, I'm saying, the U.S. has been the principal steward of the international system since World War II. And as it's changed, we have not stepped back and said, okay, this still works reasonably well. How do we accommodate these rising economic and political actors so that they have an interest in it? That's been an assumption, I think, and now a lot of people think it's discredited, of our China policy. That as they developed, as they built a middle class, as they became part of all the international institutions, that they would be a more normative power. And that what we're seeing is, from a Chinese perspective, they have not been given the kind of role that they feel they deserve, and so they're pushing out in another direction. That I blame a lot of that on mistakes made by the U.S. Some of that is Chinese ambition, but and it's hard to theorize, well, or counterfactual, whether it could have been different. But I would have liked to have tried, and then we'd at least know clearly that it's a question of Chinese ambition to be a great power, which a lot of us for many years had said was likely to be the case, and that this notion that they would be a responsible stakeholder as we defined it, I think was always a bit fanciful. But that's a problem, and I think, again, no one has a better idea for how to construct and run an international system, but they want to have a larger voice in it, and they're not getting that.
I'm going to turn it over in 1 second. I'm going to sneak in one last question before I do to Alexander and Matt, which is, again, a sort of a counter-narrative to the one that you're both agreeing on, namely that the U.S. power isn't declining. Its skill at using its power might be on the wane. But if you look at the BRICS, you mentioned BRICS, Matt. Well, Russia's economy is going to shrink, what, 3% this year? Brazil, even more, I think. India, which is the most like-minded, and very much in the Western camp informally, if not formally, in many respects, a democracy. India is going to be growing at 7 or even 8% this year, next year. And China is slowing too. And the United States is growing, not as much as it used to, not what it's accustomed to. But could we be actually making a wrong and premature call here about the descent of America from being the sort of sole superpower to being the first amongst equals? Might we be getting our assumptions wrong, Alexander? And then Matt.
Well, look, of course, the China is slowing down, and the United States economy is on the rise. It's supposed to be 2.5, 2.6 this year. But still, with this slowdown Chinese economy, the rate of growth of this economy is twice as high than in the United States. If we look at Europe, where at best it would be 1.5, it's even higher. Of course, the Chinese economy is changing, let's say, the whole structure of the economic machine. They collected all low-hanging fruits, so they have to think about something more complicated. This is, of course, is painful. So I guess this trend would continue, that relative decline of United States, not due to the crisis in United States, but just to the speed of the others. And Russia, of course, is not in a very good shape economically currently. But the nature of this crisis, current crisis in Russia, is completely different if we compare 98, 99, 2008, 2009, because there was so-called V-type crisis, falling down and fast return. The crisis 2008-9, we threw away 200 billion just to prevent the banking panic. Maybe it was not a very smart move, but we saved the society in a way. Current crisis, it has sort of a L-type, so it would be longer, not as sharp, but longer. What does it mean? It means that we have to be serious about diversification. There is no other way out. Our outlook, our own outlook, our together shows that the crude oil prices would not come back to more than 100 the day after tomorrow. So that put us for the necessity of changing the economic machine in Russia. And we are already moving in those directions, especially during this year.
Matt.
I think the question for the U.S. is, do we want to be a status quo power? So we want to keep everybody in place and hold everybody down, and that was kind of what Bob was getting at with the China. Or do you want to actually be there developing a new international system in which you're still the first among equals has a lot of power. I mean, but it does mean that you're thinking about much more inclusive. And I don't, if you listen to the presidential debates, I think we want to go back to some sort of golden age. And I don't think that's going to work. I think, despite the problems in Brazil or the slowing growth in China, you are, as you talked about in an earlier question, actually into a new world. I mean, a world which is actually, we have to keep in mind that it is much better for everybody in the world. I mean, we're pessimistic, but if you look at all the polling of the Chinese, they're very optimistic, and the Indians are very optimistic. So, I think, whether we will have a lot of momentary, or the developing states will have a lot of reverses, but it doesn't mean that it's a long-term reverse.
So I think I've managed to extract two strands of optimism from this panel. One is, there is a sort of, at an individual level, a growth in life horizons around the world, and two is that Trump is not going to be the next president. So I'm feeling chipper, much more chipper than when I began. Yes, a question, sir. That's the first hand, the yellow tie, and then the lady, and then Harlan.
Randall Fort with Raytheon. Mr. Luce, I'd like to follow up on one of your most recent points, which is the empowerment of individuals. But in fact, it's super empowerment of individuals. This device will be, in your time frame, will be between 1 billion and 1 trillion times better, more, faster, cheaper, whatever, but that's the Moore's Law progression. So, and this, which is a few $100s, will be in the hands of, today, 40% of the global population is hooked up as compared with less than 1%, even less than 20 years ago, and as that grows. So, Matt, you're the head of the strategic foresight. I just wonder, as you did your report, did you look far enough ahead at these trends for maybe a fourth option, which, with all due respect to Russia, as Feshbeck points out, you're a dying state demographically, your economy is on the ropes, and there's no chance that commodity-based economy is going to compete in the 21st century. Individuals will be increasingly empowered. There will be centrifugal forces that will challenge any central government anywhere. Information will be available. Even the best efforts of the KGB and the FSB to keep information out of the hands of Russian citizens will fail. In China too. Good luck with the Great Firewall of China. So I just wonder, is there a fourth alternative here that is positive, that individuals will increasingly have an influence on these things, that there will be crowdsourcing of foreign policy, if you will, and that may have a very different outcome than this concert of powers sitting around with Metternich kind of imposing solutions that the states are going to be contending with increasingly intelligent, increasingly empowered individuals who will be making decisions.
Crowdsourcing of foreign policy, Matt.
I guess, you know, maybe I can't make that leap to see that as actually happening. And, you know, what we have seen with a lot of the crowdsourcing is it's really the crowd that shares the same view getting together. You know, not necessarily expanding their point of view and perspective, but narrowing it. And that's what, you know, I would hope that at some time you would have the other impulse where you could have a much broadening. But I think in many ways the technologies have narrowed our perspective and increased our, you know, our prejudices. I think you're going to have to see something that is more of a dynamic between the individual and government. And I think government has been the slow one on really tapping into. And there's a lot that government can do in terms of crowdsourcing or using those technologies. But I do think leadership is a very critical question. And really government and this broader super empowered citizenry have to be working much more, and government has to find a way of working with them.
Fiero.
I would like to add some words about empowerment of individuals in such countries as Russia and China. I think that we see great changes in this sphere. Serious shifts, and please believe me, next generation, which is now emerging and coming into different spheres of economy and politics into power, is driving a new force into the empowerment of individuals on a social political level. We see revolution in social media. All social media are allowed in Russia if we compare it to China, where Facebook, Twitter, Google are prohibited and blocked. In Russia, we use all of them. We have plenty of information. Several governors and mayors of Russian cities had to retire because of mass criticism in social media. We usually have campaigns against ministers. Now we have a big campaign about corruption in different spheres of Russian politics. But I would like to also mention that you are absolutely wrong about demography of Russia. During last 5 years, we have positive demographic trends and positive dynamics. It doesn't mean that that together with economy, it would not get lower, and dynamics of demography will be as positive as they used to be during fat years. But things are positive now. How they will look on global trends, it will depend not only on the state of Russian economy, but also of readiness of our partners to give Russia opportunities to become included member of international economy.
Interesting. The lady behind the gentleman who just asked the question.
My name is Marcy Reese. I just returned from being ambassador to Bulgaria, and I'm currently working as an international consultant. I was struck by the fact that not much discussion has happened about energy. Previously, when we had any sort of geopolitical discussion, oil played a very important role in that discussion. And we know with you mentioned the decline of the price of oil as a factor. But what about different sources of energy, focus on gas, fracking, changes in approach on climate driven by climate change? How do those play into the geopolitical trends that you've been discussing?
Excellent question. Thank you. Who'd like to pick up? Bob?
Yeah, well, in the full report, we have a whole section on energy. I think that the shale revolution is probably one of the first the most transformative technologies commercialized so far this century, and it's completely changed global oil markets. And I think where we are now, I think I agree with the school of thought that says we're approaching peak demand. That there's a reason we have $40 oil. There's a glut, and Iran hasn't even come onto the market yet. And I think we're at the very beginning of a transition to a post-petroleum economy. I don't think it'll be completed by 2035, but by mid-century, I think it will be. And a lot of it depends on the commercialization of new technologies. If we get cost-effective energy storage capabilities, you're going to see a huge boom in renewables. If we don't, I think they're going to continue to be limited as they are. I think we're seeing an enormous role of gas as a transition technology, and I think, it's the end of OPEC. I don't think people have sort of gotten their arms around the shift in the geopolitics of energy yet. But, all the Middle East oil is going to China, East Asia, India. And I think and yet who's the guardian of stability in the Middle East? It's us. And I don't think anybody's thought that through. It's certainly, at least, I'm not saying the Middle East isn't important, but it's certainly an argument for burden sharing, it seems to me. And so yes, I think energy is an important factor, but I think in the opposite of the way it used to be. People used to speculate about we're running out of oil. Now it's quite clear that there's plenty of oil. It's just a factor of technology that determines how much. And I think the future of oil and gas will, as I say, depend on whether we make investment in smart grids, whether we have breakthroughs in energy technology. And there's an awful lot of, DOE alone is funding 21 different efforts to create more efficient energy storage. So it's all out there, and you can't predict the time scale. But I don't think energy is the kind of factor it used to be in the equation.
Thank you. Alexander, just out of interest, what you were talking about the need to diversify the Russian economy for reasons the questioner outlined. What is President Putin's stance in Paris? What is the Russian perspective on global climate change? I probably should know this, but I don't.
Well, we are, let's say, going in line with the majority of the countries. We are for taxation of the green gas emission.
You have a plan that targets specific reductions in Russian emissions over a specific time horizon?
Sorry, I'm not informed. I guess we have some of that.
Okay, all right. Harlan, and then the gentleman. Yeah, sorry, wait for the mic.
And I want to congratulate you and the panel for a very, very scintillating discussion. That was well done. My question is really for our Russian colleagues. Permit me an observation. First, if one really wanted to be pessimistic, 2 years ago, who would have thought that Trump, Carson, and Cruz would be serious candidates for the Republican nomination? But when we think about the future and being pessimistic, I just ask that you think about history. Think about the period from the 1890s to 1914, the 1930s, 1946, 47, 48, 49, 50, the early 60s. And those were time for real pessimistic assessments, and I don't think that we're nearly close to those points. My question is this. I agree with Alexander's assessment of Russian interest in Syria and one of the reasons why we're there, which is certainly not shared by President Obama, who wants Assad to go. I don't think the issue is a new Kissinger. The issue is who's a new Nixon, because without Nixon, there would have been no Kissinger. From Putin's perspective, I think he doesn't have a great deal of respect for President Obama, and I'm sure that's returned. But who would Putin listen to? If somebody came to a message, if somebody were going to be the new Nixon, who might that be? And how do we get some kind of a meeting of the minds between Putin and other leaders? Because quite frankly, common interest in the Middle East should overcome our conflicting interest, but quite frankly, as Bob Manning points out, too many people in this country are delusional, so unless there's some kind of breakthrough, it's pretty obvious where the Middle East is going to go through. So who would Putin listen to? Who would be the intermediary if such a person exists?
So Russia needs an American leader with which we can do business. Who would that be, Alexander? Good question.
Not necessarily an American.
Oh, okay.
Well, it's a tough question. The Putin is changing. And say during his first term, he was eager to listen. He chatted with Tony Blair. He had excellent relation with the Bush Jr., but they could not keep in line this type of relation. At a certain point, each of them broken those relations. I know that he paid respect to Henry Kissinger, but Obama do not pay the same respect to Henry Kissinger here currently, unfortunately. So to answer your question, I would say the best way would be if we could reestablish G8 as a communication platform. That would help. But I guess there is no one person who would influence Putin. He believes in himself, and he finds himself very much experienced currently.
Can I
Sure.
say one word?
Sure, sure.
I think that if we look attentively to the history, Soviet Union and then Russia had a very positive experience of interacting with Republicans in the sphere of arms control. But I'm not sure that Republicans now are ready to keep on this dialogue, are more ready than Democrats. And I think that in any scenario, it could be one question of the most significant for our agenda. To which extent we will be ready to keep dialogue on arms control reductions and arms control regime on such issues as non-proliferation, international terrorism. I can add that even in Syria, we have very positive dialogue military to on level military to military and between our security forces and exchange of information. But on political level, it's a deficit of normal dialogue, and it's the critical question.
Gentleman there. Sorry, there's, yeah.
My name is Anthony O'Day. I spent 30 years at the World Bank, including 8 years on the China country desk. And I wanted to pick up on the question whether we can expect the Chinese to be responsible global citizens, to put to the panel suggestion that they will probably go on being selectively responsible and selectively global. Case for the prosecution, behavior in the South China Sea, which looks very aggressive to me. Case for the fence, it seems they are engaging quite constructively on the global climate discussions. Shared with the panel, the Chinese are quite smart enough to keep out of the Middle East. Why on earth would you want to add to your problems by getting in there? On the other hand, the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which some in Washington see as an aggressive move, seems to be very constructive indeed. If you look at who they've nominated as the president, if you look at the consultative manner they've drafted the Articles of Agreement, and the fact that existing institutions, including Bretton Woods, cannot come close to meeting the needs for infrastructure investment.
Matt.
I would agree with your assessment, and I think, you know, we have to look back in our own history. I mean, U.S. became a global power, kind of was launched into being global power after the Second World War. But before that, we were also rather selective in what we actually focused on. And I think, you know, China especially is aware of overreach. And, you know, I've gone a number of trips because we've done similar joint exercises with them, and they keep repeating in terms of the Middle East. Well, the Middle East is the graveyard of empires, and we're not going to get stuck in it. And of course, they're very polite, not saying you are, but they are very conscious of getting overstretched. I do think that you're right, and we talk about this in the report a lot. I actually think this one road, one belt is a very innovative, creative kind of solution, dealing with their vulnerabilities, turning them into strengths, as Ed alluded to at the beginning with the borders with 14 states, and also the fact that they have excess capacity on all the things that you need for infrastructure building at the moment. And obviously those areas really need the infrastructure. So I think they've been very canny, and now with support of Russia, you don't have that competition as much. That, you know, they see that as an area where also they're not going to get in as much trouble with the U.S. South China Sea obviously is one where they are, I think, potentially. I think over time you could see China obviously graduate into being much more of the global citizen, having much more of the global interests. But that is a long-term possibility. I think I'm more struck by how much they have taken on that role, despite what are obviously their own worries about overstretch. If you look at what, you know, their outreach to Africa, their outreach to Latin America, I mean, they're now trying to play more of a political role, not simply the economic one that obviously they have and is shrinking in those areas. So I'm relatively optimistic on that side.
Alexander.
A couple sentences. You know, we're facing clear the Chinese pivot towards the West. It's clear for me. One member of our staff recently participated in the conference regarding One Belt, One Road in Madrid, the final point. You know, I agree with Matt that if we add infrastructure to Eurasia, we have the cheap labor, mineral resources, and I guess in 10 years, 15 years, it could be the region of very fast growth. And Chinese is doing very smart with those ideas. And we, of course, support it, and we try to develop together the structure of this project. And this investment bank, it's not separated from the global financial system. The whole internal procedure are borrowing from EBRD.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, and then one over there.
Anders Åslund, the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much for an excellent, very interesting discussion. I wanted to follow up on energy and diversification that primarily Alexander has talked about. We are now facing probably 1 or 2 decades of low energy prices because of the long energy cycles. And the argument has often been made that this would be good for Russia. This is the way to diversification. Oil and gas used to be 2/3 of Russia's exports. It will be about half. But this also means a different international interaction for Russia. Russia's salaries are 2-3 times higher than the Chinese still, and therefore Russia is not competitive in manufacturers. Russia has a lot of high-tech skills that China does not have to the same extent. It would be more natural then, with less energy dependence, to be interacting more with Europe rather than China, for which Russia is primarily a raw material exporter. How do you look upon this in the longer term, Alexander? Thank you.
Well, look, for the next 3 years, the options for Russian Sukhoi Superjet is something like 60, 80 machines a year. Next year, there would be test flight of wide-body jet M21, which is in direct competition with the Airbus. We are currently accomplishing the design and testing production of the new turboprop engine, which is in big demand in China. They still could not produce the modern turboprop engine. The line of superconductivity transmission operated for the length of 250 meters, and we are thinking about a longer line. So I could mention, it's, you know, very initial science, but 5 years ago, I could not mention anything of this stuff.
We've got time, I think, for one, maximum 2 more questions. I'm conscious we're pretty male-dominated up on this floor, and are there any women with questions? It's rather late in the day to be token, isn't it? Yes, the gentleman at the back.
Very good, interesting topic. At the beginning, the moderator mentioned the three scenarios, and it seems the most pessimistic is the third scenario, the inclusive international order. So in order to realize the third scenario, that means the new normal, to build into an inclusive new international order, as the U.S. as first among the other powers has a particular role to play. So what kind of strategy do you think U.S. should do in order to realize the inclusive order? And do you think the next administration will be able to do that?
Any panelists, but Matt, I mean, Matt or Bob should answer on in terms of what America. Well, actually, no. I'd be interested to hear the Russian perspective on that.
Yeah,
What
why
should
don't we
America
have the
do?
Russians?
Okay,
They're probably more optimistic.
I can suggest one example. I think that right now the question is how the international system will develop is very interconnected with the question how a system of international trade and investment will develop. And in case the United States will build their big global trade initiatives in Euro-Atlantic and in Asia-Pacific as an inclusive initiatives or not, because I know that China is very concerned how Trans-Pacific Partnership will influence on their trilateral trade free zone, free trade zone. Russia is very concerned how transatlantic trade and investment partnership will influence on the development of a Eurasian Union, and will it be ready to build connections, and to which extent with the Eurasian Union. It's not the question of economic matters and financial matters. It's also the question of politics and security.
Bob.
Yeah, I think the starting point is there's not going to be another WTO global round. We saw that with the failure of the last one, precisely because of this diffusion of power. I think TPP, there's been a dramatic shift in Chinese views of TPP over the last year and a half. 2 years ago, the Chinese thinking was, how do we kill it? And now they're thinking, how do we join it? And when I go to China and talk to the people in the economic and financial establishment, they all kind of agree with me that sooner or later China will probably accede to TPP when it is prepared to operate on those standards. I think the U.S. has an opportunity between TPP and TTIP to create something that's close to the WTO in terms of global standards. And Russia's a member of the WTO, and there's no reason that it couldn't start talking about joining TTIP if it ever became a reality, which we're some distance from that now. It's a question of what standards you operate under. And I think there's no reason why China can't join TPP. I think we're 5-10 years away from that, but similarly for Russia. So I think it's not a question of inclusion or exclusion, it's a question of standards. And it's unfortunate that Obama has had to sell TPP here as some kind of anti-China effort, because it is not in the sense that, it is in the sense that it's a question of what role the US and China play in terms of shaping the rules of world trade. And it's not a question of either or, either China writes them or we do, which is the way it's been sold to Congress. And that's unfortunate, but that's American politics.
We have time for one final brief humdinger of a question, hopefully. Sir, you.
I think it's a humdinger, but unfortunately, it's also probably more pessimistic than anything the panelists have so far said. I have a very different perspective on the energy issue. Global oil production by conventional means peaked in 2005. Since then, we've been increasingly dependent on non-conventional means, fracturing the earth, squeezing tar from sands, et cetera. These means are more expensive. That sounds counterintuitive in light of the low price of oil, but a more insightful way to look at this is in terms of energy return for energy invested. In other words, you invest the equivalent of a barrel of oil, how many barrels do you get back? with non-conventional means, it's 4 or 5 barrels versus the old days conventional means when you might get 100 barrels back. That means a decline in living standards. Might that not explain the slowness of the global economy in recovering from the economic crisis, which manifested itself in 2008? And if this trend is going to continue and we're going to see a decline in global living standards, might not that trend be more important than the question of relations between the great powers?
The future of work and middle-class incomes.
Well, I mean, certainly we've seen, you know, a stagnant and in some places decline in middle-class incomes already. I mean, that goes back a couple of decades. And, you know, as I said at the very beginning, I think these domestic issues are actually of great importance for international politics. And I think, you know, partly where we are in U.S. politics, and certainly also I think in Europe, the fact you have a lot more populism, a lot more rejectionist politics, I think it can all be traced back to the fact that you do have people who feel that they have been losers in this globalization process. And certainly, if you look at the World Bank stats on this, they have been. That particular segment, the middle class, really has been a loser in the past couple of decades. If we don't reverse that, I think we descend in, you know, the kind of politics we already have. The real worry, and I don't want to make this too pessimistic because we're at the final, but the real worry is on the technologies, is as you, not so much energy, but as you get into the emerging technologies, robotics and automation, that you could deepen those inequalities and the plight of the middle class. But, you know, I think we should, you know, going back maybe to for earlier question, I mean, you know, we can't predict leadership very well. So if you pick up Harlan's mention of Nixon, I think, you know, when he was elected, it wasn't clear, or Reagan, you know, we can remember the evil empire statements. It wasn't necessarily clear when they were elected actually what would happen in terms of particularly U.S.-Soviet or U.S.-Russia relations. I think, you know, there may be somebody out there that we don't completely understand who could actually turn things around. So.
Well, I think you know you're amongst realists when we're all praying for a Nixon. I don't know whether I'm more pessimistic or optimistic, but I certainly feel more educated at the end of that, and really enjoyed hearing from all of you. Thank you very much indeed.